On a cosmic scale, not so Mauni was barely a stone's throw away from Dunima. Of course, to any mere mortal, even just that cosmic stone toss was still an obscenely incomprehensible distance, separating the 2 points in space from each other. Something so utterly vast that it would threaten to break the mind with its seemingly infinite scale alone, if the mind was only able to even try to truly grasp it. Yet through the wonders of modern technology and hyperspace, the journey would take little more than a day, barely worth the effort of leaving the galactic plane. Still, even a day's worth of travel could easily prove to be a not minor burden on the nerves, especially when travelling from one high-stress situation right into a potential other one. And that didn't mean that the previous situation was resolved yet. It just didn't immediately concern the travelling party anymore, at the very least for the hours they were spending outside of any communication ranges. But in this case, out of sight wasn't necessarily out of mind. "You could scare Martian vets with that face you're making," a voice echoed through the thick air of the ship's small kitchen, that had so far only been filled with the constant mechanical rattle of a long out-of-style coffee machine, and was slowly becoming enriched with the dark, earthy smell of freshly ground beans. James briefly looked up from his phone to see Andres skulk into the room, already groomed in uniform mostly properly, although he did simply carry his jacket folded over his left arm, instead of wearing it on his person. If nothing else, the Major had his routine down to a science, and he looked professional and ready to take on the world, even while he seemed like he might as well collapse from oncoming sleepiness any second from now. Currently, James embodied the opposite, feeling pretty fresh and well-rested, but more looking the part of somebody who had just dragged himself out of bed. He was making full use of the fact that there were no civilians or, more importantly, cameras around him for a change, and tried to live his best, relaxed life. Well, at least when it came to appearances. He still wore the t-shirt and sweatpants he had slept in. His mechanical arm enjoyed his time out in the air, and even the weights he wore on his other shoulder and arm to counterbalance it were on full display, sticking out of his sleeves and leaving noticeable bulges wherever the fabric was loosely pulled over them. "You doing anything specific that warrants that, or did your phone just call you a particularly nasty name?" Andres continued, while putting up a chair with just his foot, before immediately falling into it in a lolling way that conflicted quite starkly with his proper vesture. James gave him a joking salute and scoff before returning his attention to the screen in his hand. "I'm running diagnostics," he mumbled, just as the white window with black text he had been waiting for popped up on the device. He read it with a glum expression, and then let his hand sink onto the table's plate with a sigh. "Not liking the results," Andres suspected, and carefully placed the pitch-black uniform jacket with white speckles all over it on top of the table, taking great care not to wrinkle it in the process. James groaned quietly and shook his head. "No fines," he said, staring up at the ceiling for a few seconds before clenching his teeth and heaving his body back into an upright position, immediately lifting the phone again and starting the entire process he had just finished over. Andres watched him with mild interest, raising a single eyebrow while taking in the sight of James quickly swiping across the screen to reopen his system controls and scan through his entire data once more. Suddenly, the coffee machine, which had been loudly grinding and brewing away for quite a while now, let out a single loud bing, and then ceased its noisy activities, indicating that it was done. Andres looked over it for a second, and then back to James, who hadn't reacted to the sound nor the fact that the coffee, which he most likely had started to make himself, was done now. "You mind if I—" he mumbled, and gestured towards the machine meaningfully, while keeping close watch of James's face. James nodded wordlessly, and waited for him to go ahead while remaining transfixed on his task of watching a grey progress bar very slowly creep through another white window on his screen. Andres stood up and slowly walked over to the cabinet. Leisurely, he took out 2 cups and wordlessly filled them both with a dark, bitter liquid that released hot, white steam into the air as he carried it from the counter back to the table, where he set one of the mugs down in front of his former trainee with a soft clank. James looked up at the sound, his gaze quickly shooting first towards the cup itself and then up at Andres' face, who was already stepping back to his old chair while smiling back at him. "Ah, thanks," James said, returning the smile in a genuine but probably slightly hasty way, before bringing his eyes back down yet again. Andres sat down and sedately took a long sip of his own steaming hot drink, while taking in James's appearance a little longer. Then, after swallowing and putting the cup down without any hurry, he probably asked, "And how long have you been running diagnostics for?" James tilted his head at the question at first, but then briefly glanced at the small digital watch in the upper right-hand corner of his screen. "About an hour?" he replied, although his tone probably made it sound more like a suggestion than a hard fact. Andrzej folded his hands on the table. "And none of them turned up a result," he continued his questioning, and James put his phone down onto the table with a sigh, covering the screen with his mechanical hand. "No," he half-stated, half-admitted. "Of course, you already knew what would come next." "In that case, I think you're probably good," Andrzej predictably said, with a hoarse chuckle, and the fingertips of James's free hand began to restlessly tap down onto the table. "I know," James said, quickly lifting his hands as he realized he was just making noise at this point. However, as he tried to think of what to say next, he didn't exactly know how to continue that statement without immediately contradicting himself, and so he brought his hands to his face as he tried to order his thoughts. "I mean, no, I don't know. But I know that I won't find out any more this way either. Not like this little program is likely to achieve anything, ultimately." Removing his hands from his face again, James quickly picked up his cup and took a long drink of Joe himself, if only to give both his body and mind something to do. The brew was way too hot for his taste and basically scalded his mouth and throat on his way down, but he ignored it and took multiple extensive sips before putting it down again. At least the pain did help him clear his mind and focus slightly. In the meantime, the smile had melted from Andrzej's face, and his former team leader was now looking back at James with a semi-worried expression, although the source of his contemplation was unclear from the outside. "Worried that your friend left us a little present?" Andrzej asked vaguely, knowing full well that James would know exactly what he was talking about, while softly removing a strand of hair out of his face. "Yes, no, I don't know," James replied, before letting out a long breath that seemed to be just as hot as the coffee he had just forced down, and he imagined his body trying to desperately thermoregulate itself by attempting to expel all the heat back out with the air. "I don't really expect anything, but I'm worried anyway." He couldn't really deny that part, not after 6 scans and counting. Andrzej scoffed slightly. "You'd think you would have a bit more trust after banking so much on your decision to support them." Andrzej started to muse, but James cut him off. "Save it, I know," he said agitatedly, and lifted his hand in a stop motion. "I know I brought this upon myself, okay? And it's not really that I don't trust Avessalon, but I just can't help it." It was frustrating, not being able to quell that constant anxiety that crept up on him when he so much as allowed himself to think of his new ally. He found himself reminded of his time back on the GES, when he couldn't shake his physical reaction of discomfort he had to Quiz, no matter how hard he tried. It was a rather similar feeling this time, although now it wasn't a vague evolutionary trait making him uncomfortable, but instead it was years and years of nurture telling him that he couldn't let his guard down. Although that itself was also pretty stupid. What guard could he keep up? It wasn't like he, by himself, held a candle to the sheer processing power that a realized possessed. Andrzej spoke up once again, pulling James's attention back onto himself. "I wasn't going to tell you to be more trusting," he clarified, and with that also defended James's actions a bit. "I was going to say, you'd think that, but it's never that easy. Personally, I think you're doing well at least covering your basics. Keeps you sharp." James nodded. "I guess," he said, before they both moved to take another sip of their coffee, which filled the room with awkward silence. Maybe the comfort would come with time. For now, James still felt like he had somewhat stumbled into this whole thing. But at least he had stuck to his guns in the end, even if his brain was now constantly screaming at him for it. At that moment, loudly clacking footsteps announced someone else's arrival to the kitchen. "Morning, Athena," James greeted, knowing he would arrive in the door any moment now without even having to look, since he recognized her quite distinctive gait. "Good morning, Tham," Andrzej joined in his greeting, knowing he could usually count on James to have the right idea about who's who when it came to footsteps. When Athena came in, she wore her entire uniform in immaculate fashion, and had bound her long blonde hair into a tight ponytail. She stopped briefly to look at the two, her face hard and unmoved. "Good morning," she still greeted them properly, even standing at attention for a brief moment, before walking over to get a cup out of the cabinet. Within seconds, she had it in her hand, filled it with hot Joe, and immediately left the room again without another word. So, she was not happy. It seemed that James wasn't taking the whole thing the worst out of everybody involved. He and Andres just kind of looked after her for 1 or 2 seconds more after she left. Neither of them needed to say anything on the matter, since they both knew her well enough to have a pretty good idea that she wasn't handling the whole realize deal all too well. "By the way, where'd you leave Shida?" Andres piped up again momentarily, probably being reminded of the feline by Athena's rather catty behaviour. "Haven't seen her in a bit." "She wants to be alone," James replied, very much mirroring the not seen her in a bit sentiment. Not that he minded. It had only been a day, after all. Every now and then, the less social feline simply needed some time for herself. Even extended periods of time, eventually. Has taken a room and been relaxing there, far as I can tell. Andres growled. "You all think that's a good idea, given everything?" James took a deep breath. "She knows she can talk to me," he said, "but I won't force her. And being alone is a very different thing for me at Inhumans." Andres simply growled again. A small ping from the table informed James that his phone was done with his diagnostics program once again. Picking it up, the device once again returned no results. And almost automatically, he started it up once again. "How does it look?" Sheila asked, some hours later, while she tried not to wince as James slowly pulled the sticky bandage off of her face. He had to turn her head to the side to allow him to access her cheek more easily, but her eyes were eagerly trying to peer down at the wound, to the point that they were hurting from the strain. Not that there was actually a chance that she would see anything. There was no way from this angle. Her own cheek was simply not within her range of vision, and the part that was way too blurry to make anything out. Still, it didn't stop her from trying, and her eyes kept peering down as strongly as possible while James pulled away the white fabric that had so far protected her wound from the outside world. Finally, he had removed it completely. Once the bandage had come off and was now sticking to his fingers, and thus sadly hanging off his hand, James inspected her face with a scrutinizing expression for a second. Then, after taking it in for a while, he smiled hesitantly. Clearly there was a lot on his mind, but he forced it all down as he said, "A beauty mark to be sure." Then he pulled his phone out of his pocket, clicking it on and activating its front-facing camera so it could be used as a mirror stand-in before handing it to Shida. With slight hesitation, Shida took the device out of his hand and looked into it, now also inspecting the right side of her face. 5 thick red streaks ran down alongside the length of it, beginning right in the space between her eye and her ear, and continuing all the way down to her jaw just next to the corner of her lips, where she had finally been able to pry her attacker's claw off of her. The now closed wounds still left the skin all around them red and irritated, and in a way they still looked like they may burst out into renewed bleeding any second now, with the way they slightly bulged out of her face, even though she knew that wasn't going to happen. Lifting her own finger, she followed the trace of the fresh scars, as if she was trying to cut them open again with her own claws, which she obviously kept retracted, as her padded fingers gently glided along her still sensitive skin. "Such deep marks for such a senseless attack," she lamented internally for a second, but it didn't last for long. It didn't really matter to her where these scars came from. It didn't even matter that much that there were scars at all. While she was pretty confident, she would have liked to claim that she had never been vain, and soon the scars would stop physically bothering her, especially with the help of some medication, and at that point they would hardly matter anymore. She glanced over at James for a second, who looked back at her with barely suppressed worry in his dark eyes. She knew he wouldn't care about the scars. Surely there was a point where appearances would also bother him, but this was far from it. He was just preoccupied with pondering what she might think about them. It was all over his face. He soon noticed her glance. "We can put a new one on if you want," he suggested, while removing her old bandage from his fingers and crumpling it up into a ball with his hand. Only for a while. It almost seemed like he had some more ideas or things he wanted to say, but he held back. "No, this is fine," Sheeta said, filling over the scars with her fingers once again, while handing James's phone back to him. "I think some air will do it good." This was a lie. She knew enough about wound healing to know that wounds needing to air out was an old tale for even older fools. But she didn't want it to be covered up again. When she went out there, she wanted them to be seen. She didn't quite know why. She had never had large scars before, but this felt right. Then again, there was definitely one person of whom she knew exactly why she wanted him to see them. James nodded, and then he moved to dispose of the old bandage. Looking around as her gaze followed them, Sheeta could see Tuya sitting not far from her. All the curtains usually separating this non-emergency medical room to give some sense of privacy to individual people being treated here had been drawn back, and thus the two women had a clear view of each other while their previous treatments were being removed. The smaller human woman's hair had recently been shaved down at its shortest parts, while the long parts remained untouched for the most part. Although a new, more striking shade of green that covered its entirety indicated that recently a new fresh coat of paint had been applied over the previous one. The colour was so striking that it almost distracted from the thick lines running across her tanned neck that were starting to fade into the colour and form of older scars already. Whatever the humans put into their blood when they modified themselves, it at least seemed to work. Although Tuya's injuries had been even more severe than Sheeta's, it seemed they were already further along in their healing. "These almost look snazzy with the hair," Admir, who had been assisting her with the bandage removal, commented as he met with James at the trash can, although his gaze remained fixed to his patient. "Maybe you should consider leaving it like that." Tuya was looking at herself in a mirror on the wall, grabbing at her skin and pulling it tighter to get a better idea of what the wound looked like from her own limited perspective. After a few seconds of pulling and pushing off skin, she dropped her hands, leaving the scars to fall back into their natural form. "Nah, I think I'd rather get a tattoo," she said, stepping away from the mirror with her hands folded behind her head, her elbows sticking up into the air. "Once we're back on Earth, I'll talk to my surgeon. Should be a simple affair, right?" With that last question, she turned to look all the way across the room, right at James. He took one look at her. "Yeah, that bit of scar tissue will be no problem," he said confidently, giving her a thumbs up with his mechanical arm, almost as if to say, much simpler than this. Then, very subtly, almost imperceptibly, he glanced over at Sheeta. It didn't take a genius to realize what was going through his mind, and it was sweet that he at least wanted her to be aware of it. But no, that option just wasn't for Sheeta. Other people could do what they wanted, she had gone that far, but it still wasn't for her. So, she reassuringly shook her head at him, hoping that it was clear that she had both understood and willingly declined. The brief surprise flashing across James's face, followed by a soft smile and his attention then returning to Tuya, at least indicated that he had understood. Sheeta smiled lightly, as her thoughts drifted off a bit. Being in the sterile atmosphere of an infirmary brought back some memories. Not many, admittedly. Getting hurt had never been a big problem for her in the past, at least not during her work in the military, but every now and then she had gotten sick. Just once in a while, and her bedside hadn't been exactly packed back then. Apart from the medics and doctors, just very few faces would come by regularly. 2, in fact. She wondered what they might have said seeing her like this. She would have scolded her for letting someone get the jump on her. And he would have been worried about her injuries, and then said how glad he was that she was okay. And then he would probably have said something to the effect of, "Good that you held back and nobody got seriously hurt." She could basically hear him. His dark voice. His amused, chattering chuckles that he barely held back. "Of course, it would have been better if you stopped Mr. Allwyn's outburst as well. Good thing there were Deathworlders and could take the abuse, huh? Oh well, all's well that ends well. I'm still proud of you for handling everything so well yourself." Sheeta's hand tightly clenched around the soft sheet of the bed she was sitting on. She imagined it so vividly. She knew exactly how he talked, how he thought. At least she had always felt like she knew how he thought. How wrong she had been. He had a lot to answer for. "Hey!" A voice suddenly ripped her out of her thoughts, and her head and ears shot up as she searched around for its source. Admir had yelled at her from across the room, and was now pointing at her with an impish expression, his gaze fixated on her hand that was now holding the bedsheet in a tight fist. "Use your boyfriend as a scratching post if you have to, but leave the sheets alone. We still need those," the human scolded her amusedly, before sniggering brightly to himself. "And if you absolutely need to tear up sheets, I'd recommend a more fun way of doing that." Sheeta relaxed her grip, and although she could still feel it bubbling inside her, she smiled. A few hours later, the sergeant and some other soldiers that had previously accompanied them to the planet came to see them off as the team plus James and Sheeta had gathered around the shuttle to begin their approach of the station. You sure you don't want us to come along as additional backup, sir? The leader of the bunch asked, and Sheeta watched him as he respectfully stepped up to James. But James just shook his head. I don't want to take an entire armed squad along to the station, he said, and looked back at his former team that would already be accompanying them. We're here on private business, after all. Most likely we're already making way more of a ruckus than we should. I'm sure everything will be fine and we won't need more firepower. Why aren't we just docking the entire ship? Tia asked. Well, she was already in the process of boarding the shuttle that would take them to the station. The crew could stretch their legs a bit, and they could also refuel and resupply since we're here already. James cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, I'm not that sure, he replied with a hoarse cough. I'd rather not have our ship immobilized, just in case. The statement, along with his behaviour, got a bit of a chuckle out of the surrounding people, but nobody said anything against it in the end. After all, the mechanical arm James used to awkwardly scratch the back of his head as he spoke was a good reminder of the kind of thing that could happen on a communal station, if they didn't remain vigilant. She'd remained quiet while the goodbyes were wrapped up. Her mind was already on the station. She wondered what she would say. She wondered how he would react. Maybe he wouldn't show up. Maybe he somehow knew they were coming. No, he couldn't. Nobody could have known beforehand. But maybe he would just refuse to talk to them. What then? Then we'll make him talk, of course. A voice from somewhere in the back of her mind answered. A voice that she didn't particularly like. But somehow, she couldn't disagree with it. She wouldn't just let him walk away. She couldn't. She looked up as she felt James take her by the hand. With a mixed expression on his face, he gestured towards the shuttle, indicating that they should get going. Sheeta nodded and came along with him as he stepped inside. At this point, the process of waiting for the atmosphere in the dock to void, and then approach their next destination had become routine. Nossa Mauni, for all it was worth, was also just another station. Sheeta had seen it often when they passed it with the GES. Of course, just as was the case with the GCS, she had never actually set foot onto it, but at least its outside was familiar to her. Then again, it was a station. Just another ring of metal floating out in space. Visually, they weren't all that distinct when looked at from afar. And landing on it wasn't that different either. Fly in, wait for the atmosphere to return, and then step out into yet another large metal shuttle bay. All rather standard. After all, the community had a knack for making things like this run smoothly. At least the human shuttle was allowed onto the station without question. After all, there was technically a conflict happening between them and the community, so it could technically have been more of a problem. But currently nobody had the wish to further stir the fires of said conflict. And even if they did, Nossa Mauni was far from the galaxy's core, and therefore a bit more open when it came to its relations, than something like the GCS was, with its leadership being not nearly as prestigious of a position as the Leader Supreme. Especially its close proximity and therefore association to multiple Deathworlds made it less reputable and influential in the eyes of the galaxy than would have been typical for a station of its size. But still, it had size. In this region of the galaxy, it was the biggest communal station, and thus responsible for a lot of trade and travel, even if the people often came here more out of necessity than out of any wish to do so. It was ironic, but for a reunion of the kind they had before them, there was almost no better place. Though said reunion would still have to wait a moment, because the sheer amount of protection the humans had brought with them obviously meant there was an extensive registration necessary before they could freely move on the station. However, as they were starting to get in touch with the local authorities to make sure everything would be handled and administered properly, a call came through from their own ship. "We thought we'd let you know," one of the bridge personnel said over the line, after they had taken the time to fly around the area for a bit. "We have confirmed visual of the GES-32, which is currently docked in Dock 37 in Nossa Mauni. Looks like we did make it in time." A loud clacking filled the air, step by step, as a group of people moved along one of the many elevated, size-separated walkways that snaked their way all throughout the immediate skyline of Nossa Mauni, just like they tended to do in every communally run space station. The person who was the source of the clacking was admittedly a bit too short for the medium-large to large walkway he was currently traversing. However, since his two companions walking along with him fit right into that range of sizes, and he was also fairly certain that he would, in case of a collision with a large compatriot, still come out as the uninjured party, he still used it without wasting a second thought on it. while each of his steps clacked out loudly with the sound of wood or metal. The many feet of one of his companions slightly skittered along next to him, while the other step was almost as loud as his own, since his large claws scratched along the hard ground each time he lifted or lowered his huge feet. "Still hard to believe that they completely beat us to it," a voice that appeared as a regular old tuning scale of notes said, into the mostly empty air, that was only broken up by the group's footsteps so far. None of them had said anything for a while, but apparently HFY finally had had enough of the silence. "And all while we were out of comm range. Weeks' worth of orders, possibly all down the drain." Many of her thin arms fiddled with each other as she spoke, possibly to help her better order her thoughts, as she contemplated what would happen next. Next to her, Tshirt sighed. His dark violet feathers had been half standing for a while now, giving the large avian a sort of puffy appearance. "And I was looking forward to it, I guess," he said glumly, and shook his plumage out, puffing it up even more. "Guess there goes our station in a stable system." "We don't know that yet," Reprieg said, and used his one free hand to smooth out the fur on top of his trunk, while the other one remained firmly clasped around his wooden crutch. "So far we haven't heard anything about the orders changing yet." "Yeah, but with the humans around in the system soon and their militaries working together," Tshirt countered, sounding rather unmoved by Reprieg's objection, "I don't see us winning any prizes there. And I'm sure Command knows that much too." "Something must have happened." HFY jumped in again, the scale of her voice lowering into a deeper register. "Neither humans nor Miats usually work that fast diplomatically. There's something going on behind the scenes." She sounded very sure of herself as she said that, and Reprieg was inclined to trust her. Ever since her last assessment of humanity had turned out to be rather flawed, she had put a lot of time into trying to actually understand her future and past targets a lot better. "Well, if we brought those two together, we probably don't want anything to do with it," Tshirt surmised, but Reprieg couldn't say that he disagreed on that front either. That was a crossfire that he most likely would not want to get pulled into. Then again, he didn't exactly have a choice in the matter. "We'll see if our orders change before we move out," he simply stated, feeling like wondering about any other possibilities at this time was little more than a waste of energy. "At the very least we didn't have to go while James was still there," Tshirt mused further, chuckling a bit, while likely playing out the scenario of trying to work while the freak was around in his head. That would have been awkward. "Yeah, you can say that again," Reprieg agreed, and chuckled as well, emphasizing it further by tapping the floor with his crutch twice. HFY clearly didn't find the prospect and insinuations quite as funny as her male colleagues did. However, she did grant them a pity laugh that sounded like wild strings being tugged. Out of all of them, she still harbored the most negative feelings towards the freak. She just never was quite able to get over the fact that he had taken Reprieg's leg back on the GCS. At that moment, the assistant on Reprieg's free arm suddenly came to life, ringing at him incessantly to inform him that he was being contacted. He had to stop for a second to accept the call, since he needed his other arm to do it. He still found it ironic that it so often felt like he was one-armed instead of one-legged, since one hand was permanently bound to the crutch as long as he wanted to walk. Now leaning on said crutch to keep his balance, he tapped at his assistant. "Yes, hello?" he asked carefully, since he hadn't paid proper attention to who was calling him there. Could these be the new orders they had been talking about? "You're late!" A high voice came from the other end of the line, and any anticipation he had had dissipated at an instant. "Excuse me?" he asked back into the device, pretending like he had not understood. In reality he had, but he wasn't going to react when asked like that. "You're late!" the voice repeated, just louder this time. Reprieg just kept going. "Is this a prank call?" he asked, trying his best to hold back the smugness in his voice. "If so, I'm going to hang up now." An unbelievably exasperated sigh came from the assistant speakers, and he could already hear the person on the other side take in a very deep breath. "You are late!" the voice erupted again, yelling, but at least yelling perfectly articulated. "Ah, Sky! You could have said that, that's you," he greeted, pretending like he had just now recognized her voice. "And yes, I'm late. It seems I'm still not quite used to walking long distances with a crutch. I must have missed just the time. Is the captain waiting for me?" "Take your shoes, sir," the cacique gave back annoyedly. "And yes, but he won't be for long." "Tell him I'll be right there," Reprieg assured her before adding, "But, please, properly." "He don't care how I talk," Sky dismissed him, with an audible rolling of her eyes, before cutting the connection without further pleasantries. Reprieg sighed. Well, you could take a girl out of the streets. Sounds like we should speed up a bit, Desil said, having obviously overheard the entire conversation, as he also had to wait for Reprieg before they could keep going. Sure, if you think you can keep up, Reprieg challenged him, and once again grabbed his crutch tightly.